Honey, can we talk? I really need to talk to you.
1 in 4 American men under 35 reports feeling lonely every single day. Not occasionally, not after a rough week, every day. And here's the thing that makes that number genuinely strange. The research is clear that men feel emotions with the same intensity as anyone else. So what's actually going on? Today, we're getting into why emotional availability is so hard for so many men right now. Specifically, we're going to unpack what emotional unavailability actually looks like, where it comes from in culture and upbringing, and what the neuroscience says is happening inside the brain when a man shuts down. By the end of this, you'll have a much clearer picture of why this isn't about men not caring and what it would actually take to change. I've got someone here who's been deep in this research, so let's get right into it.
He's just never there for me. Honey, try to talk, but he just shuts down. It's like he's completely unavailable. I know exactly what you mean.
What's the first thing people get completely wrong about this?
The biggest misconception, hands down, is that emotionally unavailable men don't have emotions. That's just not what the research shows. According to Science Insights, emotional unavailability in men is rarely about not having emotions. It's about a combination of learned behavior, cultural conditioning, and sometimes unrecognized mental health struggles that make emotional connection feel threatening or unfamiliar.
So it's not an absence of feeling, it's more like a blockage.
Exactly. And the pattern of emotional unavailability is pretty specific when you look at it closely. It's not just being closed off on a bad day. Science Insights describes it as consistent, avoiding conversations that require vulnerability, leaving relationships before they get serious, shutting down when a partner asks how you're feeling. Some of the less obvious signs are things like keeping romantic options open as a safety net, or feeling drained and anxious by intimacy rather than nourished by it.
That last one is interesting, feeling drained by intimacy. That's not what most people would expect.
Right, and it points to something deeper. The pattern tends to repeat across relationships, and the person rarely recognizes their own role in the cycle. That's what makes it so persistent. It's not a conscious choice most of the time.
So if it's not a conscious choice, where does it actually start? Like, what's the origin story here?
Culture. That's the single biggest driver, according to Science Insights. From early childhood, boys absorb the message that being tough and confident is what makes them men. Crying, expressing fear, admitting vulnerability, all of that gets coded as weakness. And over years, this conditioning produces what psychologists call restrictive emotionality, a learned habit of limiting which emotions are acceptable to feel or express.
Restrictive emotionality. That's a term I hadn't heard before.
It's a really useful one. And there's a related concept called normative male alexithymia. Researchers at Neurolaunch describe it as the gap between feeling and expressing. Men feel emotions with the same intensity as anyone else, but many grow up without the vocabulary to name what's happening inside them. So sadness or fear surfaces as anger, silence, or even physical symptoms like a headache that won't quit.
Wait, physical symptoms? Like the emotion literally shows up in the body instead of being expressed?
That's exactly what the research suggests. Neurolaunch puts it this way. Suppressing emotions like sadness or fear doesn't eliminate them. It redirects them into anger, physical symptoms, or substance use. The emotion has to go somewhere.
That reframe is kind of wild when you sit with it. The emotion is still there, it's just wearing a disguise.
A very convincing disguise. And here's where it gets even more interesting. There's a 2025 study published in the journal Personality and Individual Differences that found rigid masculine norms centered on aggression and dominance were strongly linked to restrictive emotionality. Men who internalized those norms were less likely to seek help for emotional problems or even suicidal thoughts.
So the norms themselves are doing real damage.
Yes, but here's the part that really stopped me. The study found that the restricted emotional expression itself predicted avoidance of help-seeking, not the masculine beliefs alone. Meaning, a man can intellectually reject the idea that real men don't cry and still find himself completely unable to access or articulate his emotions. The training runs deeper than belief. It becomes neurological habit.
That's the counterintuitive part, right? You can update your values and still be stuck in the old wiring.
Exactly. And that's why just telling men to open up more doesn't really work as advice. The issue isn't awareness, it's access.
I want to zoom out for a second because this isn't just a Western thing, right? Like, is this pattern showing up globally?
Very much so. A cross-cultural analysis by Renda Zhang on Medium makes the point that from the stoic, reserved expressions typical in Eastern cultures to the more open and direct emotional displays in the West, cultural norms deeply influence how men navigate their feelings. The strong, silent type archetype shows up across cultures. It just wears different clothes depending on where you are.
So the specific flavor changes, but the underlying pressure is pretty universal.
And what Zhang points out is that men today are caught in this dual pressure, rooted in cultural heritage on one side and modern societal expectations pushing for more openness on the other. That tension affects not just emotional health, but the ability to build healthy, balanced relationships.
That dual pressure sounds genuinely exhausting, like you're getting contradictory instructions from every direction.
It is. And it's worth noting that this isn't a new conversation. Male emotional life has been treated as a footnote in psychology for most of the field's history. Neurolaunch points out that early researchers focused heavily on women's emotional experiences, partly because of the outdated assumption that men simply didn't have much of an inner emotional world to study. That assumption was wrong, and the last few decades of research have been busy proving it.
So the field itself was kind of reinforcing the blind spot.
Right. And what's emerged from the newer research is a much more interesting picture. Men aren't emotionally shallow. They're often emotionally fluent in a much narrower dialect, one built by biology, reinforced by culture, and rarely challenged until something breaks.
I love that framing. Emotionally fluent in a narrower dialect. Okay, so let's get into the neuroscience side of this because I think that's where it gets really concrete. What's actually happening in the brain?
So Dr. Sidney Ceruto, a neuroscientist at MindLab, makes a distinction that I think is really clarifying. Men's intimacy struggles are primarily driven by what's called impaired interoceptive accuracy, not emotional absence. The nervous system generates emotional signals correctly, but access to those signals is compromised.
So the signal is being sent, it's just not being received clearly.
Exactly. And here's where it gets really specific. Chronic emotional suppression physically reorganizes the insular cortex, which is the part of the brain involved in processing internal body states. MindLab's research shows that this makes the pathway from internal state to conscious awareness progressively less reliable over time. And repeated suppression increases amygdala reactivity while weakening prefrontal regulation.
So what starts as a behavioral habit, just not talking about feelings, actually reshapes the brain's architecture.
Within weeks, according to MindLab, what begins as a behavioral habit becomes entrenched neural architecture. That's why it's so hard to just decide to be more emotionally available. The hardware has been modified.
Okay, that reframes the whole conversation. It's not a character flaw, it's a structural issue.
And MindLab makes that point explicitly about something called the pursuer-withdrawer dynamic. You know, when one partner keeps pushing for emotional connection and the other keeps pulling back. That dynamic reflects two nervous systems caught in a feedback loop, not character failure. The resistance to vulnerability is a protective physiological response, not stubbornness.
That's actually a really compassionate way to look at it. Because from the outside, the withdrawal can feel like rejection.
Honey, can we talk? I really need to talk to you.
And it often gets interpreted that way, which makes the loop worse. The partner pursues harder, the man withdraws further, and neither person is doing anything wrong. They're just caught in a pattern neither of them fully understands.
Let's talk about the real world stakes here because I think the numbers are pretty sobering. What does this actually cost men?
The costs are measurable and serious. According to the APA's Monitor on Psychology from 2025, men die by suicide at nearly 4 times the rate of women. They experience fatal drug overdoses at more than twice the rate of women. And while nearly 1 in 5 men experience a mental health condition each year, fewer than half, 41.6%, seek treatment, compared with 56.9% of women.
Those numbers are stark. And the loneliness data we opened with fits right into that picture.
It does. Science Insights cites Gallup data from 2023 and 2024 showing that 1 in 4 American men under 35 reports feeling lonely on a daily basis, significantly higher than the national average of 18% and higher than young women at the same age. And the article notes that no other wealthy democratic country has a larger gap in loneliness between young men and the rest of the adult population.
That's a uniquely American problem in terms of scale.
And Equimundo, the Center for Masculinities and Social Justice, released their State of American Men 2025 report, which points to economic insecurity, isolation, and adherence to a rigid masculinity ideology as major drivers of distress. They found that men facing financial strain were 16 times more likely to report suicidal thoughts than those who were not.
16 times. That's not a marginal difference.
And the Equimundo report also found that 86% of men and 77% of women view being a provider as defining manhood. So when economic conditions make that role harder to fulfill, it doesn't just create financial stress, it creates an identity crisis. And identity crises don't exactly make people more emotionally available.
That's a really important connection. The economic pressure feeding directly into the emotional shutdown.
It's all interconnected. And the APA's 2025 piece also flags something that I think gets underreported. Many socially isolated boys are being drawn to online spaces that promote rigid hypermasculinity. So the cultural conditioning that starts in childhood is getting amplified digitally for a whole generation.
That's a troubling feedback loop. The isolation drives them toward content that reinforces the very norms making them more isolated.
Exactly. And it's worth pushing back on one framing that I think oversimplifies this, the toxic masculinity label. Simply Psychology's 2026 analysis makes a really important distinction. Rigidity, not masculinity itself, is the risk factor. Traits like courage, responsibility, and stoicism under acute pressure are genuine assets. The problem is when those traits get applied inflexibly to every emotional situation.
So it's not about dismantling masculinity, it's about making it more flexible.
Simply Psychology puts it really well. Healthier masculinity isn't less masculine, it's more flexible. The same values of strength, responsibility, and protection extended to include one's own maintenance. That's a much more workable frame than telling men to be less of what they are.
I want to bring in the personality angle here because I think it adds another layer. Not every man is emotionally unavailable for the same reasons, right? Some of it is just who they are.
Right, and this is where the Big Five personality model becomes useful. According to Simply Psychology, the Big Five, openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, are the most widely used model for understanding personality. And these traits are influenced significantly by both genes and environment, with an estimated heritability of 40 to 60%.
So personality is partly baked in from the start?
Partly. And the trait most directly connected to emotional availability is openness to experience. Psychology Fanatic describes it this way. Think of your mind like a window. A person high in openness has the window wide open. A person low in openness keeps it cracked or closed. And one of the key features of high openness is emotional depth, being more attuned to your own emotions and the emotions of others.
So someone low in openness isn't just less curious about the world, they're also less tuned into their own inner life.
That's the connection. And here's the interesting wrinkle. The Psychiatry and Psychotherapy podcast cites research showing that people tend to have higher openness when they're younger, and it declines steadily as they age. So the window naturally starts closing over time.
Which means the window of opportunity, no pun intended, to build emotional habits might be earlier than we think.
And there's also the agreeableness dimension. Simply Psychology links high agreeableness to being empathetic and helpful, while low agreeableness is associated with being more competitive, skeptical, and focused on self-interest. Those low agreeableness traits map pretty closely onto the masculine norms we've been talking about.
So the cultural conditioning and the personality traits can reinforce each other. If you're naturally lower in agreeableness and you grow up in an environment that rewards emotional restraint, those two things compound.
That's a really good way to put it. And it explains why the same cultural environment produces very different outcomes in different men. It's not one size fits all. It's an interaction between what you're born with and what you're taught.
Okay, so here's a question I keep coming back to. Is this actually fixable? Like, if the brain has been rewired and the personality traits are partly genetic, is there a real path forward?
The research says yes, and pretty clearly. MindLab makes the point that naming internal states, what they call affect labeling, activates the prefrontal cortex and directly reduces amygdala activation. It's a neural regulation intervention with measurable structural effects. So something as simple as putting words to what you're feeling actually changes the brain's response in real time.
That's almost too simple. Like, naming the feeling does something?
It does something measurable, yes. And Simply Psychology's 2026 piece makes the broader point that the skill deficit is trainable at any age. Emotional literacy, the ability to recognize, name, and communicate emotions, can be developed through therapy, mindfulness, and intentional practice. The hardware can be modified in the other direction too.
So the same neuroplasticity that allowed the suppression to become habit can work in reverse.
Exactly. And Science Insights frames emotional intimacy for men in a way I think is worth sitting with. It's the feeling that you can be fully known by another person without losing their respect. That's the destination. The barriers are real, but they're not permanent.
Fully known without losing respect. That's a really precise definition of what's at stake.
And Science Insights is careful to push back on the stereotype that men uniformly prefer action over words or are wired to avoid feelings. The research shows many men want deep emotional connection, they just face real, measurable obstacles in building it. The desire is there. The access pathway is what's blocked.
That distinction matters a lot. Wanting connection but not having the tools to get there is a very different problem than not wanting it at all.
And it changes how you approach the problem. If you think men don't want connection, you try to convince them they should. If you understand they want it but lack access, you work on building the access pathway. Those are completely different interventions.
So when you step back from everything we've covered, the cultural conditioning, the neuroscience, the personality layer, the real world costs, what's the through line here?
The through line is that emotional unavailability in men is a learned structural problem, not a character flaw and not an absence of feeling. The emotional signal is intact. It's the access pathway that gets compromised, first by cultural conditioning in childhood, then reinforced by neurological habit, and sometimes compounded by personality traits that make emotional openness feel less natural.
And the stakes are genuinely high. We're not just talking about relationships being harder. We're talking about men dying by suicide at nearly 4 times the rate of women, fewer than half seeking mental health treatment, and 1 in 4 young men feeling lonely every single day.
Right. And the Equimundo report's framing is useful here. Economic insecurity, isolation, and rigid masculinity ideology are all feeding into the same crisis. These aren't separate problems. They're the same problem wearing different faces.
And the fix isn't to tell men to be less masculine. It's to make the definition of strength flexible enough to include knowing what you feel and being able to say it.
Simply Psychology's 2026 piece says it better than I could. Healthier masculinity extends the same values of strength and responsibility to include one's own maintenance. That's not a radical ask. That's just completing the picture. Here's what I keep thinking about. We opened with that number, 1 in 4 men under 35 feeling lonely every day. And now we know that loneliness isn't happening because men don't want connection. It's happening because the tools to build that connection were never handed to them. And in some cases, the brain has literally been restructured around avoiding it. And the good news, if there is good news, is that the research is clear that this is changeable. Affect labeling, emotional literacy, therapy, mindfulness, these aren't soft suggestions. They're interventions with measurable neurological effects. The window can be reopened.
So if you're listening to this and you recognize some of these patterns in yourself or in someone you care about, the most useful thing to take away is probably this. The struggle isn't a personality defect. It's a structural gap. And structural gaps can be filled.
And maybe the first step is just naming it, which, as it turns out, is also the first neurological intervention. Putting words to what's happening inside you literally changes what happens next in the brain.
We started with a man who can't name what he's feeling. Turns out naming it is exactly where the healing begins. Thanks for being here for this one.